By way of stark contrast, the UK music scene was suddenly changing. Punk had arrived, and the Americans simply couldn't understand it. To them, it seemed like a lot of unattractive parochial whining. However, to me personally, if not musically, it literally meant the force of change, as I increasingly felt the hostility directed towards me from this new wave of negative thinking. This general feeling of discomfort came to a head in March 1977, first in a confrontation with The Clash at Dingwall's Club in London, then, a few days later, in a meeting with the Sex Pistols that had repercussions far wider than I would ever have expected. It was a Friday evening, and I'd been doing some recording at Morgan Studios with my good friend and session engineer George Nicholson, with whom I'd worked on the later Wally stuff for Atlantic. I suggested to George that we stop off at the Speakeasy before going home, and we arrived at the club at about 11:30. As we walked in past the bar, we bumped into Jim Diamond, who told us that the Sex Pistols were in the restaurant. "They seem a bit rowdy," he confided with characteristic Scottish understatement. It was the day they'd signed with A&M Records, and they'd been celebrating. Having gone on a wrecking spree at the record company offices, they'd arrived at the Speakeasy with fueled-up entourage and were having their own private party in the restaurant. George and I decided to leave and finished up our drinks. A tall blonde guy in a green boiler suit had been pushing his way through the crowd around the bar and bumped into me as we turned to go. He confronted me immediately. "When are the Pistols going to be on Whistle Test then?" he demanded. "This isn't the right time or place," was my reply. "Give me a call in the office on Monday morning." With that, he took a swing at me, cuffing me round the shoulder and knocking drinks off the bar. It seemed to be some kind of signal. All hell broke loose. Suddenly people were punching and kicking their way through the crowd. People began to scatter as I was pulled round to the other side of the bar for protection. I couldn't see George. Glass was flying everywhere. As I tried to gather my senses, I was confronted by about half a dozen Mohican-cut drunks, faces spitting hatred, their fists clutching broken glass. I was in serious trouble here, and more scared than I'd ever been in my life. 3 options flashed through my mind as I struggled to maintain my composure. The first was to try to run, but I was in a cul-de-sac on the wrong side of the bar with a wall at my back, and they were barring my way. The second was to fight, but at 6-1 against, the odds weren't favourable. I decided on option 3. "Let's talk," I began. "What do you think you're going to achieve by this?" One of them kicked out at me while another tried to slash me with a beer glass. Miraculously, and seemingly out of nowhere, about a dozen guys appeared in a kind of human wall between them and me, surrounding me in a protective circle as they pushed and fought us through the madness and round the edge of the bar towards safety. I found out later that it was mainly the Procol Harum road crew who, like us, had just popped in for a quiet drink. You saved my life, guys, literally. I was incredibly lucky to walk out of there with little more than a bruise on my leg and cuts on my back. George was not so fortunate. As I was being pulled away, Sid Vicious had stabbed a broken bottle into George's face. He'd been quick enough to deflect the glass up and away from his eyes, but the jagged edge had torn into his wrist and opened up a wide, ugly gash right through the top of his head, from forehead to crown. I found him lying semi-conscious in a pool of blood in the reception area of the club. We had to get out of there, but it wasn't easy. The word was out, and punk reinforcements were arriving from nearby clubs to join in the rumble and kick a hippie. It took about 20 people to get us through the door, across the road, and into George's car. Someone told me that the police later cordoned off that whole block of Margaret Street in an effort to contain the trouble. I drove us straight to the Hammersmith Hospital, where George had 14 stitches in his head wound. By now, Sue and I had given up the struggle of trying to keep our marriage together in the face of all the rock and roll madness, and Jackie and I had moved into a flat together in Putney. I arrived home there at about 8:30 in the morning to find the press already gathering outside, wanting quotes about the Sex Pistols incident. I had absolutely nothing to say. I really hadn't got into music for this. We were deluged with calls for days. One of the first on the line was Derek Green, the UK boss of A&M Records. "I'm sorry to hear about all this, Bob," he said. "You'll be glad to know that I'm dropping them from the label." Next to call was Aidan Day, my old producer on the Radio 1 review show with Alan Black, now programme controller at Capital Radio. "I've banned all Sex Pistols records from the playlist," he told me angrily. The Sex Pistols incident left me feeling sullied, invaded and very disillusioned. The memory of the ugly violence of that night at the Speakeasy was proving hard to shrug off, but I was equally shaken by the wider hostility it provoked. The music press was now wading in with some witheringly personal attacks. Punk was the new thing, said the papers. The old grey whistle test was, well, old and grey. A piece by Michael Watts in Melody Maker accurately sums up the attitude towards me at that time. And I quote, "He has undeniably been the most reviled personality both on television and within rock. A wimp has been the most general criticism. His questioning of interviewees has been deemed less than penetrating, and his eagerness to spread around gentle bonhomie has caused severe irritation." These words straddled a huge, dark pen drawing of myself, looking over my shoulder at 3 pen quills embedded in my back. Some of the criticism of the programme was